Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I am an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we're conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding NATO's role in the war in Ukraine is Dr. Luca Ratti. Professor Ratti's research and teaching interests lie in post-World War II in international history, specifically US-European relations, NATO's evolution, European security and defense policies, and international relations theory. Professor Ratti is author of 3 monographs, 2 edited volumes, and several book chapters. His work has appeared in journals such as the International History Review, the Journal of Transatlantic Studies, Diplomacy and Statecraft, the Journal of Slavic Military Studies, the Journal of Middle Eastern Geopolitics, and Mediterranean Politics. He's also an associate professor of history of international relations at Rome III University and visiting scholar at Carleton University. We'll begin with some basic questions. So the first question is, what is NATO?
Well, first and foremost, this is a military alliance that was set up in the early stages of the Cold War between a number of West European countries, the United States and Canada. So I think the best way to think about this institution was certainly to start from the military and political association that was established in the Cold War. But we also need to add that NATO proved to be much more than a military institution if we go and analyze the history of this very, very peculiar, I have to say, group of countries working together. And the long-term ambition of the founding fathers of the alliance was not only to set up a military alliance against the Soviet threat in the early stages of the Cold War, but to build a transatlantic community. And if we look at the North Atlantic Treaty that was signed in April 1949, the founding charter of this alliance, we will see a number of articles, especially I'd like to focus on Article 2, I think that make it clear that member states commit themselves to harmonize not only the political and military policies, but also the economic and social policies. And I think this article is really clarify how much broader and how much more ambitious than just a military bloc was the initial attempt to link these countries together. And especially with the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1991, we have seen NATO taking on a much more political role than military role. Maybe lastly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought back emphasis on the regional task of the alliance, defense and deterrence, but still we should not forget that NATO's ambitions is much broader. And the way in which the alliance has dealt with its process of expansion, for example, already expected in the founding treaty and clarified by Article 10, does really make it clear that there is here the ambition to build a much more lasting community than just like a military alliance. So if you need, or if somebody needs somehow, in a nutshell, to clarify what NATO is, I will say it's a political military alliance with the ambition to build a long-term political and economic community among its members.
Thank you. And moving on to the question, why does Ukraine want to join NATO?
Well, I think again here we could answer this question by relating to my first answer. First of all, it is a political and military alliance, and despite focusing on Article 2 in my previous answer, I think we cannot understand the history of NATO if we do not discuss the centrality of Article 5. This is the article that established a mutual defense clause among its members. Is the article that guaranteed to the Europeans that the United States and Canada would have come to help out in the case of a Soviet attack during the Cold War, and is really what defines the alliance in its primary function of guaranteeing security to its members. For a country like Ukraine that emerged at the dissolution of the Soviet Union and trying somehow to define its role in a new European security architecture, gaining membership of the alliance would be the ultimate, I would say, security guarantee that in the case of external attacks, such as the one that Ukraine has been enduring over the last few months, there will be a commitment by all the other 30 members of the alliance to intervene and support Ukraine. So first of all, I would say the concern is about military and political security, but on the Ukrainian side, I'm convinced that there is also the ambition to become part of a club that is also a community where members negotiate, where members are kept together by the same values, commitment to liberal democratic reforms, commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes among them. Look at the relationship, for example, between Greece and Turkey, two countries that have long been at odds with one another, but certainly not gone to war with one another, also thanks to the common membership of the NATO Treaty Organization. So security is probably a paramount driver of Ukraine's attempt of gaining NATO membership, but the aspect of a broader ambition to become part of the transatlantic community cannot be discounted also for the Ukrainian side. And certainly it is difficult, I think, to say where the boundary lies now between these two concerns. But I believe that all countries that have joined the alliance have done it for different purposes, military security, but at the same time, the ambition to construct a common political and cultural project.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, for kind of foundational questions, why is Russia against NATO, and why does it oppose and has historically opposed Ukraine joining NATO?
Also, in this case, I'm afraid we need to dig into history and look at the origins of the alliance. When NATO was set up in 1949, although the Soviet Union was never mentioned in the founding treaty, certainly this was a bloc that Moscow understood would counterbalance its expansion across Europe. But let's remember that up to the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union didn't formally react to NATO. So although the USSR considered NATO as a potential problem for its great power ambitions, at the same time, Moscow believed that it could live substantially in a Europe that was divided into two blocs. So this was the long-term ambition of the Soviet Union, the division of Europe into two blocks where Moscow would have its sphere of influence. And if Western Europe was under British or under American or under NATO hat, this didn't matter for the Soviet as long as Moscow was guaranteed its sphere of influence. Trouble started in the mid-50s when NATO began its process of expansion, and this again confirms that Ukraine is certainly not an isolated case. And the Federal Republic of Germany became a member of NATO in May 1955. That was already a turning point that led Moscow to respond with the establishment of the Warsaw Pact. Why? Because the Soviet Union understood that with Germany coming in the alliance, NATO was beginning to transform itself. It would no longer be limited to Western Europe, but maybe the long-term plan of an institution that would encompass the entire continent was beginning to take shape. Already in 1952, Greece and Turkey had become members of the alliance. Other countries were neutral, but still entertaining good relations with NATO. So this created somehow, I would argue, a concern in the Soviet Union that maybe the long-term process of expanding the transatlantic community into the heart of Europe was beginning to take shape. For the next, let's say 40, 45 years, this remained, however, only a marginal concern, because after Germany became a member, there were no more formal expansions of NATO until the 1980s, for example, when Spain became a member. So it is only with the end of the Cold War that Soviet concerns and then Russian concerns about NATO expansion started to become, I would say, a real element or a real reason of concern on the table of Russian and Soviet leaders. Why? Because when Germany was united, the expectation of the West, especially the expectation of the Americans, but also the expectation of the West European partners, would be that the best route to German unification would be in placing the united German state into the structures of NATO. There were no other alternatives. The Warsaw Pact was disintegrated, the Soviet bloc was disintegrated. So what the Soviet Union was calling for, maybe a joint membership of NATO in a joint membership of Germany in NATO and the Warsaw Pact was simply unrealistic. But at the same time, this solution created a precedent. And the example set up by Germany would soon be followed by other former Soviet bloc states or captive nations across Eastern Europe, be it Poland, be it Czechoslovakia, before its separation into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993, be it Hungary. These countries, they set an example. They didn't want to remain in a limbo or maybe in an area where countries may be tempted to renationalize security. And they saw NATO as a long-term solution, first of all, for the political and military security, and we go back again to my original argument, but secondly, also as an opportunity to become part of a community, to be reunited with the peers in Western Europe, and to be reunited now in the long term, also with countries with whom also the Poles, the Hungarians, the Slovaks felt a very close association. Let's think, for example, at the Polish migrants to the United States already during the time of World War I. Let's think about the Czechs or the Slovaks migrants. So the idea of a community was also at the core, I think, of this vision. Certainly, the more the alliance is expanded, the more the concerns of the Kremlin have grown, especially because, and here comes, I believe, maybe an element, a critical element in the relationship between NATO and Russia, especially because the relationship between the alliance and Moscow was never clarified. The two sides never made it clear what would happen in the long term to Russia. And according to the North Atlantic Treaty, any European nation, so including Russia itself, that was willing to participate somehow in this sharing of the burden of transatlantic security would be admitted or would have a right to apply for membership. And in the early 2000s, we saw an attempt by both sides somehow to clarify these issues, maybe to set up a NATO-Russia council that would prepare for future cooperation between the two sides. But again, unfortunately, we didn't see this dream being turned into reality. So the bottom line remains that given its failure, I would say, given the common failure to clarify the relationship, the Russians have continued to see NATO as an alliance that is rooted in the Cold War, as a Cold War relic, and to perceive its expansion not only as an attempt to create, let's say, a liberal democratic space of international relations, but also as an attempt to encircle Russia, undermine Russian security, and maybe in the long term, bring down the current regime in Moscow. And Ukraine, given its extensive historical, economic, cultural, linguistic, and I think this would be a very long list, ties with the Russian space, especially for the eastern part of Ukraine, was seen for a long time by Russian leaders, I would say at least since the mid-1990s. So this is not only like a peculiar element of Putin's foreign policy, but we could certainly go back to Yeltsin's foreign policy when the two sides were actually engaged with one another, was seen as a red line. And unfortunately, already 2008, 2014, and again now, we see this, let's say, unsolved problem of the Cold War coming back to disturb relations between NATO and Russia, and at this time, unfortunately, to present Europe with the risk of another enlarged military confrontation on the continent.